Hello, everybody, and welcome to Tanchaz Talk, the world's only English language program focusing primarily on Hungarian folk music. My name is Kalman Magyar Öcsi, coming to you today from Toronto, Canada, as usual. This is a special episode of Tanchaz Talk interviews. Now, episodes of the regular Tanchaz Talk, which combine a mix of music and stories delivered by yours truly, are available as always on tanchaz.com. That's TANCHAZ.com, or on YouTube. Just search Tanchaz Talk and subscribe so you don't miss anything going forward. Today, as I mentioned, is an interview of an episode of Tanchaz Talk interviews. This is where I delve into long-form interviews with a wide array of guests. Episodes of Tanchaz Talk interviews are available on all popular podcast platforms, including Apple, Google, and Spotify podcast platforms. So make sure you subscribe and leave a nice review if you like what you hear, and of course, tell a friend. Today I'm excited to tell you that my guest is Walt Mahovlich. Walt was born in 1952 in Cleveland, Ohio. He is Croatian on his father's side and Hungarian on his mother's side. His mom's family is actually from Muconya, which is near Miskolc, northeastern Hungary. His grandparents came to this country, to the United States, the old-fashioned way, by steamship before World War I at various times, of course, with the different grandparents. But by the World War I, they were all here on this side of the water. Walt grew up in Cleveland, Ohio. He studied chemistry and polymer science at Case Western Reserve University and the University of Akron. And he worked as a chemist and a polymer scientist for many years until pursuing music full-time. More on that soon. The musical side of Walt. Well, Walt grew up listening to Hungarian and Croatian music of his parents. He attended picnics and grape harvests and other community events, and he began playing music and the clarinet and then the piano in the 5th grade, and he studied recorder in high school. He grew closer to the music of his heritage when he started attending college and university. He hooked up with some Croatian tamburica players, joining a tamburica orchestra and a junior tamburicins ensemble as well in Cleveland. Then he also met some local Macedonians who were traditional village musicians, recently immigrated from the former Yugoslavia. They were looking for a clarinetist in their band, and Walt started playing weddings and dances with those Macedonian musicians. And the musical world of the former Yugoslav countries really started opening up to Walt. He joined a traditional Serbian band in the late 1970s as well. And he took a special trip in the summer of 1977 to the University of Sarajevo, where he studied ethnology, and we'll get into what that means during the interview. Since his musical start in the 70s, Walt has become a household name among East European immigrant communities throughout the U.S. and Canada. He plays multiple instruments: saxophone, clarinet, the frula, the furuya, the accordion, and the gaida, which is the bagpipe. And he has many musical specialties. Some of them I mentioned already: Macedonian, Croatian, Hungarian. More on that in a moment. He also plays klezmer music and Serbian music, Romanian, and many other nationalities. He plays music from the Carpathian Basin, and of course, equally so, a wide array of Balkan music from the Balkan countries. And he plays contemporary wedding music for many nationalities, including for the Hungarians in Cleveland and Detroit and beyond, and is very well loved by those communities. He's taught music at scores of camps, including the Eastern European Folklife Center's Balkan Camp, the Balkan Arts Music Camp, Buffalo on the Roof Yiddish Arts Festival. Here's where it starts getting really impressive. His career of performance is not only is he a celebrity in the church hall basements, but he's also performed at Smithsonian Festival of American Folklife. The first one was in 1976. This was a big influence on him. Jimmy Carter's inaugural, the rededication of Ellis Island, the bicentennial celebration of the Constitution in Philadelphia, the Smotra Folklora in Zagreb, Croatia. It's a big festival in Croatia. And then Carnegie Hall. How do you get there? You practice. Lincoln Center, and also the Kennedy Center in Washington. Oh, I'm getting exhausted talking about Walt. He's so fantastically qualified. The album he produced, Nova Domovina, Balkan Slavic music of the industrial Midwest, won a United Nations award for ethnomusicology. That's right, from the UNESCO folks. They granted him an award for ethnomusicology. And he's performed and recorded with many other bands. And Plavo Ponoc, Jorgovan, Budovic, which is a klezmer group which has included in its past Tomáš Gomboly and Pénzes Géza, which some listeners here might know from the Tanchaz movement. Sevda, Turli Tava, which is a Macedonian orchestra, and Brave Old World, and one of my favorites, Slavic Soul Party. Relevant to Hungarian music specifically, Walter is the founder of the Harmonia Band of Cleveland, which many of us know as the top band in North America, which presents the music of the countries from within the Carpathian Basin, which of course includes the music of Hungary. He's performed with members of Gyanta and Eletfa many times, both on stage and at Tanchaz's. I love playing Tanchaz's with Walt. When he's on that clarinet, I kind of give him the look, or do you want a solo? He gives me the little nod, and then he's off playing a wonderful solo. I love listening to Walt jam on the clarinet during Tanchaz's, which is a rare event, but brings me much joy. He collaborates very closely with the Hungarian Scouts groups of Cleveland for many of their events, and he has a very wide knowledge base of the Hungarian nota repertoire, which we'll talk about. Walt opted not to pursue engineering further when he was about 40 years old, and he devoted himself to music on a full-time basis, and we'll talk about that with him. However, he still teaches chemistry along with ESL and environmental science in post-secondary schools. He's a great teacher. He has lectured at universities on music and culture of Eastern Europe, at Oberlin School of Music, the Cleveland Institute of Art, and many others. And he curates a world music series in Cleveland called Inside World Music. In summary, Walt is a highly educated and experienced scientist, but also has an immense knowledge of the music of not only the Carpathian Basin countries, but the Balkans as well. He's a wonderful musician, teacher, and community partner. I'm very pleased to welcome on the phone, on the line here, from Cleveland, Ohio, Walt Mahovlich. Hello, Walt.
Hi, Kalman. How are you?
I'm good. I need to take a breath after introducing you. Very nice to have you on the program. You're a good friend of the Hungarian folk community and a good friend of mine personally. And I'm always so happy to speak with you, Walt.
I'm very pleased to be here, and gosh, to realize that I met you when you were about the age that your nephews are right now.
Really? You sure I was that old? I think I.
You might have been younger, because I think we met in '85.
Okay, 85.
I met
yeah.
your dad several years before that.
Okay, so 85. Yeah, I was around 11 or 12. Yeah, that makes sense. Sense. Well, I've come a long way, and my hair is gray, kind of like yours now, Walt.
Yeah. Mine is white.
White. Yeah, exactly. Walt, where does that passion that you have in the music to really immerse yourself in this? You weren't necessarily raised like me, which is like really in the deep water of just one folkloric community speaking the language, and 100% in the Scouts and the church and this and that. For you have this passion for not just two nationalities of the music, but for many. And where's that coming from? And tell me more about your musical drive to become what you are today.
Yeah, it's interesting how it's sort of branched out. Well, unlike you, I'm not Hungarian on both sides. My mother was Hungarian. Both my parents were American-born, but neither of them spoke English until they were about 8 years old. They grew up mostly in the Ohio Valley, in the area between Pittsburgh and Wheeling, which the usual sort of coal mines and steel mills, that sort of thing. But we were always aware at home of our ethnic backgrounds and proud of it. Unfortunately, because Hungarian and Croatian, while they share a few words, there's no way you could communicate.
That's right. No way.
So my parents spoke English in the home, although both of them knew the language very well. My mom was educated in Hungarian. She could read and write, and her mother also really loved Hungarian music. I mean, she described it that when my grandmother was cleaning the house, she would put on a stack of 78s of, the old with Berki Bela and Magyar Imre and people like that. And we inherited some of those, and I listened to them a lot. My mother really loved Hungarian music. And while I was born in Cleveland, we actually, when I was about 4 years old, we moved to a small town. Now it's really a suburb, but then it was kind of a small town called Bedford, which had a large Hungarian and Slovak and some other East European ethnic group population. In large part, our sense of ethnic identity was kind of in the home. Certainly in school, I didn't learn a thing about Europe anywhere east of Germany, except that, of course, the Russians were our enemies somehow. And but everybody I knew, if you were white, your grandmother didn't speak English. It was basically how it was, and I assume that's what the whole world was like. At least that's what the United States was like. My mom really tried to instill in me a love of Hungarian culture. I remember that frequently when I was in elementary school, she would decide that we were going to take a field trip. She'd take me out of school for the day. We would, get on the bus and ride to the Buckeye Road neighborhood, which was the old Hungarian neighborhood in Cleveland. And frankly, about all you would hear on the street was Hungarian. There were bookstores, there were restaurants, all kinds of things like that. We would occasionally, go to the Grape Harvest festivals. My mother loved Hungarian songs, and she sang some of them. I mean, she wasn't in any way a professional singer or somebody who would sing in front of other people, but she played the piano a little bit. We got a piano at home and some books of Magyar nota. I was encouraged in playing that. She absolutely loved it. My father knew a lot of Croatian folk songs, and we would occasionally go to the Croatian picnics. Though when I was a kid, we didn't go to the ones around Cleveland. Mostly he was tied to his hometown outside of Wheeling, and we would go to things that the lodge there would have. And, he taught me some of the first songs that I know, which I still know in Croatian. So there was that. And again, I said it was kind of private. I wasn't, as a kid, I wasn't a member of a junior tamburica group. It would have been kind of impossible for me to be part of the Hungarian Scouts. It would have been great because I know my mother would have been thrilled if I had been able to learn Hungarian as a kid, which unfortunately I could not because her brother lived in Cleveland, but our Hungarian relatives were scattered around the United States, and I didn't hear it much. My dad's sisters and his mother, they all spoke Croatian. I learned a little bit as a kid. I think the thing that really did it for me, though, was when I went away to college, to Hope College in Holland, Michigan, for my freshman year. My mom had passed away during my senior year of high school, and so it was kind of a break with the past. And I go to this place in western Michigan, which actually is a very ethnic town in a lot of ways, but the mixture is completely different. I mean, the college was founded and populated largely by people from the Netherlands, by the Dutch who had come in the 1850s, who were Dutch Reformed, which culturally, let me tell you, is very different than being Hungarian Reformed, as I soon found out. And then the other people in town, there were a lot of people whose roots were in Mexico who had come up as migrant farmers and decided to stay. It was jarring because I really felt like a fish out of water. And a lot of just kind of the general cultural values I had were, not there. I'll be honest, I got along with the Mexicans a lot better because they seem to have the same kind of joy in the same things that we do. The other thing that was going on is that there happened to be a relationship between Hope College and the University of Sarajevo, which several years later I took advantage of. But it also made me feel like, I don't know, like I was some kind of dancing bear or something, because, here's an authentic Yugoslavian. It just was always very weird, and so I decided after 1 year there that I needed to come back to Cleveland. And I mean, I plunged myself into the ethnic scene. I got involved with some Croatian friends initially. I made an effort to learn to speak Croatian. My dad and my aunts were thrilled with this, and I managed to get a pretty good level of fluency. So I became exposed to that. Also, I should back up a moment. Growing up, if we did, I certainly remember going down to Buckeye Road to places like Settler's Tavern and, hearing some of the greats play. For example, John Udvari, who was Alex Udvari's father, the wonderful cymbalum player. And, of course, Alex is a great colleague and a phenomenal player. And Ernie King and Rabioshka and those guys. That were playing what I thought of as, the real Hungarian music. And it is real Hungarian music, which we'll get to.
Yeah.
So, I knew a lot of those tunes in my head. I didn't have, because it was kind of a closed club as to, who would play. Because the people who were playing were professionals. And in Cleveland, most of them were Roma, were gypsies from northern Hungary, and actually a lot of them were families from Slovakia. And it was kind of, it was something that I didn't see an end to it. But I always liked it, and even in college, because where I lived on campus at Case Western Reserve was not very far from Buckeye Road. And so when I could save up my money for a special night out or a special date, that's where I would go, is to Settler's Tavern. So I remained, actively conscious of both sides. But for certainly the first 15 years, nearly 20 years of my musical career, it was really non-Hungarian stuff that was connected with my Croatian heritage and, by extension, with the other South Slavic nationalities like the Macedonians and the Serbs. When I met some Macedonian friends on campus who had a band, there were two local clarinetists. One had a daughter who had died and so had given up playing because he was in mourning, and the other one ended up moving back to the old country, and they asked me if I would play with them, and I didn't know enough to say no. Yeah. I didn't realize how complicated it was, but I just, when you're young, you just learn things, and the Macedonian guys I played with, they absolutely had they hardly had any musical vocabulary. It was, you listen and you play and you learn how things go, and that's it. I mean, because it was really kind of like learning the music by going to a village.
Yeah.
And that's what I did. I mean, with the Croatian stuff, it was somewhat similar, but, most people knew how to read music. We didn't use it. Uh, and again, when I started playing in the Serbian group as well, it was somewhat similar. And of course, this was at a point, this was well before the really tragic wars of the early 90s, and at a point when the relations between the various South Slavic groups were actually, becoming quite good. Mm-hmm. And so it was interesting, and I could see connections.
Walt, you said a few things I want to unpack a little.
Sure.
It sounds like to me, the old saying, "Separation makes the heart grow fonder." That's what you experienced when you were away from the nest for a year.
Totally.
I want to paint or help paint a picture of Buckeye Road, which is the Hungarian area in Cleveland, or was. Cleveland was one of the biggest Hungarian cities in the world. I remember some statistic that Cleveland is the second most was the second most populous Hungarian city after Budapest, or something like that, right?
Yeah.
So, paint the picture for me. What it would look like, and 70s might be the right decade. It was probably much more vibrant even before that, but you're walking down that road. What are you seeing? Are you seeing Hungarian signs all over the place, and the pastry shops, and the bars, and the restaurants, and the churches? What? Just help paint a picture for us, please.
Sure, but I'll tell you what. I'm going to go back to the '60s because that's where my very best memories, and that was sort of a peak.
Yeah.
So what you would see, first off, you'd see several churches. There were at least 2 Roman Catholic churches, Hungarian. St. Elizabeth is still there and still active. Mm-hmm. There was St. John's Byzantine Catholic Hungarian Church, which is still in existence, but not on Buckeye Road. There was Hungarian Lutheran Church. There was Baptist. There was naturally Hungarian Reformed. And there were schools connected certainly with the Catholic churches. You would see all kinds of signs in Hungarian. You'd also see some in Slovak, because it was a Slovak settlement as well. But Hungarians were definitely dominant, and particularly because there had been such an influx after 1948, and particularly after 1956, you heard almost exclusively Hungarian spoken on the street. You would see, Magyar Hentes. There'd be Hungarian butcher shops, bookstores, bars, restaurants. Settler's Tavern was kind of a fancy white tablecloth restaurant, that featured gypsy music every night. Alex Udvari, by the late 60s, he was playing there. There was the Magyar Áruház, the kind of general store that dealt in knickknacks and textiles and music books and all sorts of things. There were certainly innumerable bars on the streets, on the side streets. It wasn't unusual to see houses that had, the sort of kalachoi flowers painted on the shutters or something like that. And I do remember seeing, houses that had like a seke kapu, the traditional Transylvanian gate in front of their house. Sometimes it would be made out of wrought iron. That's the one that I kind of remember, which I know isn't really traditional, but it was inspired by it. When there was there also was a Hungarian music store. I remember I bought a citara there, which is doing, this particular citara is doing what it does best. It's hanging on my wall right now.
I have one of those.
Yeah, it's not a very good instrument. I didn't know,
Right.
And also, I remember going to Frank Staponosh's place. he had an outfit called B&F Records that recorded lots and lots of Hungarian musicians, and particularly people who were passing through, such as Banyak, Kalman, and just wonderful stuff. He reissued a lot of stuff that had been out on, that had originally come out on 78s. I mean, one of the recordings that he issued that I treasure was the recordings of John Brankac, whose nickname was a Tsigan Vaida, who was really amazing. And he's related to the whole bunch from Braddock, Pennsylvania, which, the so-called Slovak-Hungarian gypsies. And it was wonderful. And I know my mom was very impressed to see that in this record store, there was that record, because he had stayed at my grandmother's house in outside of Martins Ferry, Ohio, in the Ohio River Valley, whenever they would come through to play. But it was a very vibrant place. For my mother, it was like a trip to the old country that she had never been to. I mean, it was a trip. It was a trip to her. It was a trip to her childhood in that way. And for me, it was a way for her to instill that feeling in me and that love of that stuff. You can look at me and tell that I had a love of Hungarian food, which I still do. Yeah. And also to hear the music. A couple of I mentioned Settler's Tavern, which was a sort of white cloth restaurant. There was another place I went to as a kid with our family and some friends called the Gypsy Cellar, which was an amazing place. This was run by a violinist called Rabioshka. He was a non-Gypsy Hungarian, but he had a really wonderful ensemble that played there every night. He was quite a showman. He's the sort of guy who would wear a cape when he played. He'd get up on the table and play in this, it was sort of it was a basement restaurant and bar with a mural of Hungary, and really a lot of celebrities, particularly Hungarian American celebrities, would come through, and he had their pictures up. It was really vibrant, and it lasted for something like 70 or 80 years, from what I understand, probably from around 1890 till about 1980. Things had changed for a variety of reasons. I mean, part of it was, frankly, the Hungarians were better off. There wasn't a continuous flow of new immigrants to replenish the neighborhood. And the logical place to move next door, if you just moved down the street, was a place called Shaker Heights. But that was really a little too rich for the blood of most Hungarians. So they moved out to more distant suburbs. And then, you had all sorts of, problems connected with blockbusting and things like that we saw in a lot of cities in the United States.
Yeah, and we don't need to, it's.
No, we don't need to. But the thing is, it was an amazing place. For me, it was fascinating. Right. And it also meant that when I came back to Cleveland and went to college, that was one of the two ethnic neighborhoods that I always sought out, because there also was a Croatian neighborhood on St. Clair Avenue, and where I spent a lot of time, rehearsing with the Junior Tammy group and all of that. But it made a big impression on me.
Each city, most American big cities, especially in the East and the Midwest, have a similar type of story. And what I want to say, we don't, it's not like, those good old days. We wish you could have that neighborhood. That neighborhood's not going to exist for Hungarians anymore. And like as you say, there are very good reasons for that, and some of those reasons are very good and promising for the future, of course. And some of the neighborhoods that are now like that for other ethnicities, it's because they have that flow of immigration. That's very well put, Walt. I want to talk a little about the music scene. You mentioned some names, and and you also mentioned that it was a kind of a closed shop for musicians, and that's very interesting observation, Walt, because it's a closed shop as well for even in Transylvania and in Hungary in the villages. The notion that of revival musician, a Caucasian, non-gypsy, so to speak, like me and you would just show up and start playing music in villages. That wouldn't exist. I mean, that's your job. That's a profession, and that was left to the professionals, right? Now, nowadays, if you want to hear Hungarian music in Cleveland, you're going to listen to a Harmonia Band, but more or less. But back then, it sounds like there are these, Roma, dynasties almost. That are first, second, maybe even third generation, and some of these musicians are still tucked away throughout the U.S., aren't they? I mean, you can still find these people. I'm thinking about George Bacci in Pittsburgh, for instance. Not many people know, and even people listening right now may not know that George is one of the finest violinists, in the United States, in terms of Hungarian gypsy music. And he hardly speaks Hungarian, like this is, multi-generation dynasty type of musician. So, these musicians that were there, Walt, I also heard that they were a rolling kind of every 6 or 9 months, a new gypsy band from Hungary would come out and have kind of a residency at some of these restaurants. Can you talk some more about that?
Well, I could talk a little bit about that. As far as I know, in Cleveland, we did not see that rolling event, in part because after 56, for a long time, it became very difficult for people to come from Hungary to the United States. Mm-hmm. I know there were some musicians who did come through, and like I say, I know that Frank Stepanos recorded some of them, but as far as I knew, most of them had been refugees after 56. Now, I'd like to say a couple of things. First off, I totally agree with you about George Bacci. It has been an absolute pleasure to play with him when I've done this, because he's subbed with Harmonia. I've also played with him. He is one of the last of the gypsy musicians, last of the gypsy primashok in the United States. Mm-hmm. I mean, there are lots of his relatives that are phenomenal musicians, but again, because it's, as well as their culture, it's also a job. A lot of them, when I've been to some of the funerals and whatnot, people come in from around the country, particularly from Las Vegas, and they're playing popular music of one sort or another, which is fitting. And I mean, a man's got to make a living.
Yep.
But yeah, but like I say, it was it seemed like kind of a closed shop. I mean, there were some non-Hungarian players, there were some non-Roma, non-Gypsy players who played with the bands. I mean, Rabioshka is a very good example. I believe that Ernie King himself was not a gypsy, but again, they grew up right in the neighborhood. They were, very gifted musicians. Udvari himself is of mixed background. His father was a Magyar, actually. Udvari János, a phenomenal player. So there was that. I think one thing I could contrast it with is my experience playing Croatian music. Because, tamburica and Croatian songs, even though I'll be forthright in saying strings, I'm not very good at. I mean, they put a brach in my hand, which is the alto-sized tamburica, and I was able to kind of stumble around on it. But there's kind of a back porch tradition of that, of playing in groups and playing informally and welcoming people in, and it wasn't really seen as a profession. That's the other thing that I would say. Mm-hmm. So, there's no sort of like guarded secrets,
right?
In that sense,
right?
And it's different. And I also, when I think about playing with the Macedonians, the music of the Macedonian villagers that I played with, again, that was, kind of open. If you were interested in playing it, they would welcome you in. I mean, there actually weren't that many people who were interested in playing. They were mostly interested in being played to, which is why they would get some Croatian-Hungarian boy to play with the group. But I was not that unusual because there were lots of cases of people like this,
right.
And also, so there was that. Mm-hmm. And it's not that I felt somehow insulted or excluded by those Hungarian, primarily gypsy musicians. It's just it didn't occur to me that one could just, start playing it.
Right.
Except at home for your own amusement.
Right, and there's also a pretty high level of sophistication that's generally needed that comes with years of training and the chord structures and all that, and there's a simple way of playing something, and then there's that way of playing something.
That is absolutely correct. And again, because it is music played by professionals who are very highly trained from childhood, and by their relatives, and encouraged, and there's just an enormous amount to learn. It is, comparing it to the Croatian music, while they're both very rich traditions, the typical level of playing doesn't compare with what Hungarian professional gypsy musicians would do.
Yeah. Even
if these were guys who were playing in rural Hungary someplace, playing weddings, but you spend your time doing it.
Walt, I've been keeping a lid on this in terms of nomenclature for the first few interviews, and even in my other Tanchaz Talk Music and Stories series, the word nota. Okay, so this is and we've a word mentioned this. I'll give some thesaurus synonyms, so to speak, for what we refer to as nota, because that term comes up a lot, and I think I'm keeping a lid on it until now because I think you're the perfect person to talk about it, because you were really steeped in that in that, and that's pretty much all you heard coming up, and I would not classify you necessarily as a Tanchaz musician, but you have played Tanchaz, but I would more put you into that that kind of nota front. So we talk about nota, we could say restaurant music or the cafe music, and even more generally gypsy music. And this is the music that most people around the world, even in Hungary, think of when they think of what Hungarian music is and Hungarian folk music is. Now, it's impossible to separate the two, because actually the nota means song in Hungarian, literally, but the nota tradition is a part of the village music, which was quite surprising to a lot of the Tanchaz revivalist purists coming up in the 70s and 80s, that they took a couple of decades to realize that, wait a second, they have notas in the villages, and it's a huge part of what they're doing there, and you can't separate the two. So talk to me about nota, and maybe try to explain how it might differ and or loop in to the Tanchaz type of music, which of course is the music of the various villages of Transylvania and Hungary and beyond.
Well, okay, I'm going to, take this from the perspective, by and large, as the grandson of immigrants, and somebody who is, as Hungarian Americans refer to it, an old settler. Mm-hmm. So, in the first place, what we think of as nota, which includes songs where we know the composer, and also includes a certain way of playing Hungarian folk songs instrumentally, that my grandparents thought of that as their folk music. And it's interesting, when I listen to the 78s recorded in Europe, or for that matter, even recorded in the United States, from the 1920s and before, the style of playing, to me, sounds very folky. Because it was, this was the music of weddings. I don't know about Transylvania because I really had not met any musicians from Transylvania that were playing, what we think of as Tanchaz music until way later, and we'll talk about that. But, that was thought of as the folk music. And I mean, descriptions from my uncle and my mom of some of the things that happened out at the Hungarian picnics, including a lot of things I didn't witness. I mean, there were traditions of sort of dancing lined up on a board and some specific dances, but mostly it was czardash, in one form or another. And that was the music of celebrations. And, when I hear some of the stuff from northeastern Hungary that's made it into the Tanchaz repertoire, or like Szakmár stuff and that kind of thing, to me, this sounds very much like the way the gypsy musicians played here, and what would have been, valued. It had a primary place, and if you just listen to Lakatos Sándor, the famous concert gypsy violinist, doing his virtuosic stuff, you would get a different picture of what the music was like. And to think of it as quote-unquote restaurant music misunderstands it, because yes, playing in restaurants was part of it, and an important part of it, but this was the music of celebrations for the Hungarian peasant who came here, or the Hungarian middle-class person, for that matter, who came here, for a very long time. This was what was brought here beginning in the 1880s, and in fact, you should do an interview with George Bacci or with Stevie Pishkor, who's a kind of a Roma historian here, although he prefers to use the word gypsy when speaking English, about how it is that group, which came from near Kosovo, modern, now called Košice in what's now Slovakia, how they ended up coming here. Because, if you had a group of Hungarians living here, and my grandparents went first to Munhall, Pennsylvania, which is now part of Pittsburgh, you couldn't imagine having Hungarians living in a place unless there were gypsy musicians to serve them. Similarly with Slovaks, and they were playing for both of them because they knew all of that, again, as professionals. And so that was an important part of it. I know that my mother's stepfather, her actual father, died from the pandemic in 1918, and a guy that he knew from the village ended up marrying my grandmother. But I do have a picture of him playing a button accordion, and two people who were related through being godparents, also from the same region, are there posing with violins. I would have loved to hear what they played in this picture from the 1920s.
Yeah.
But exactly what it would have been. But so that's the role that served. Now there may have been, and again, this was something that if you were a Hungarian and came to the United States, chances are you would know these songs. Even though there might be some local stuff from your specific village or region that would not be known to others.
Right.
That might be it. The other thing is that I happened, on my first trip to Budapest in the 1990s, I went to Gyökér, the club, the Tanchaz club.
Yeah.
Great experience. I'm in the basement. They've got an old gypsy musician from Transylvania that everybody is clustered around, while he's playing, these various tunes, many of which were, I didn't know. It was beautiful, of course. But, and right in the middle, of course, he starts playing Shape and then goes on to something else. And I'm thinking, aha!
Mm-hmm.
So it's a little bit like, I'm not sure, I think it might have been Count Basie who said it, if it sounds good, it is good.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, he played it in the same style. He played it in the same style. He played it in his style.
Right.
And that kind of showed me that there was a bit of a false dichotomy.
Absolutely. Yeah, absolutely.
I think you also know. I mean, think about camp last year. They had the wonderful band Heaven Ed.
Yeah.
From who can play. They are a fantastic Tanchaz band, but they play weddings in Transylvania.
Yeah.
For Hungarians, and there we are at 2, 3 in the morning, and they're by the bar at the Chipke Tabor.
Mm-hmm.
And they're playing just a lot of things that I know is kind of like popular Hungarian nota songs.
Yeah.
The sorts that you sing when you're at a party.
Yep.
And they would switch back and forth. I mean, they're self-aware enough to know kind of the differences in the repertoire, because of course they're young guys and they're tapped into all of this. But that was just naturally part of what they would play. So.
Well, I remember I went to, as a teenager in the early 20s, a wedding in Mera, and also in Kalotaszeg, and also in Visha in Mezerség, and the bigger dance and legényes and all that stuff going on in the couples dances. But I'll tell you, the bigger part of the party was always when they launched into the popular nota stuff, and that's just it's a dichotomy. Now, oftentimes we have true traditional revivalists kind of hold their nose when and ask whisper in the primás's ear, hey, can you change tunes and don't play Jó estét kívánok, please? Because we don't want to hear that. We want to hear something from this village, right? So. Yeah. It's interesting, that dichotomy, but I think you've done a nice job explaining what nota is, and I wrote down something that you talk about the role of the nota and the role of music, and that's very ROLE, of course, and that's very interesting. Ultimately it's functional music, and if you want to do a Tanchaz and dance to dance a Vajda Szent Iványi Csárdas, the dancer might, in that role, might want to hear something from that village specifically, but a lot of Vajda Szent Iványi Csárdas are nota. So, so it's we can go on and on about that, but...
Well, there is something I would like to add to that, Öcsi.
Yeah.
Playing with Harmonia, what I have seen over the past 20 years is a sort of a reabsorption of aspects of things that started out as kind of self-conscious Tanchaz revival, like dancing legényes, for example. Mm-hmm. There were people, who grew up in Transylvania, and this was just a part of everyday life. But what I've seen now is through influence of groups like the Hungarian Scouts and whatnot, that has become an everyday part of going to a ball, and it doesn't seem like it's a conscious revival at this point. Mm-hmm. It's something that's just part of, you go to a Hungarian ball, and Harmonia's going to play, and, of course they're going to play legényes, with Színbolom, of course, because that's, the center of our band, which they probably wouldn't put onto an ethnographic field recording, let's put it that way. But that's what you do. And then you also ask them if they can play a serba, mm-hmm. which of course we could. But it's just part of, it's as much of expected things as, say, at the picnics it used to be, to do the Goya dance or something like this.
Yeah.
You know, this is part of what you do at a Hungarian event.
Mm-hmm.
And it's funny because when I first started playing the balls, 25 years ago, something like that, I remember being told, now don't play any of that village stuff, that folk dancer stuff. But now the people in charge, you know, play it, you know, wait, you know, give the older people a chance to, you know, do their Chadadash and their, you know, sort of waltzes and polkas and Latin stuff, the ball music, and of course Hungarian tangos.
Yes.
Yeah.
The original tango.
Yeah, but you know, the thing is, listen, particularly between the two wars and certainly into the 50s, tango was a real important part of Hungarian popular music. And we use that word popular music sometimes as being derogatory, as saying, oh, that's commercial, that's like the Beatles or something like that. Mm-hmm. But it was organically part of what people did as what they considered music, you know? I mean, so, you know, that's kind of how I look at it. I mean, obviously, you know, I am not going to play, unless asked to, you know, if I'm playing for a bunch of people that, you know, really want to be dancing to village music, or what they perceive as village music, I'm not going to just strike up a tango. But on the other hand, you know, if you go into a village, you'd be surprised.
Well, Walt, I mean, you know, we play tangos and waltzes oftentimes in Tanchaz's, right around the middle, and here, and in Toronto and beyond, and even at the ultra Tanchaz centric Chipke band, and everybody gets up and dances, and that's it's, you know, we're at this point, it's not that we don't have to be like, you know, Shiite Tanchaz folks where we're like ultra, you know. Like ultra concerned about our future, you know, we're okay. You know, we know this is in safe hands, and
well, you know, it really is. And like I say, the way that it's been kind of reabsorbed into the Hungarian culture, it doesn't seem to be in any danger of dying out.
Although I would love to take your Hungarian grandmother or mother and you know, go back to the 30s and 40s and play him some, you know, Vajda Szent Iványi, Sebes Forduló, or Gyimesi, you know, Lassú Magyaros, and see, we don't see their reaction. Of course, we hear a lot. This is Romanian stuff, and that's interesting. That's all they kind of that's what they thought of back then. And we talk a lot of, you know, a couple of previous interviews ago with Steve Katansky and the like. We talk about how, you know, Hungarians, even in the 80s, were hearing this at Hungarian clubs and saying, what the hell is this Romanian music? This mezerség, you know? It's Romanian music, so.
Well, Kalman, I have something to add to that. And that was, a number of years back, maybe is it 15, 20 years back, the Smithsonian Festival of American Folklife featured Romania. Mm-hmm. And, of course, the Romanian government sent only... as far as I know, they didn't send any Hungarian musicians as part of that. They sent everybody who's ethnically Romanian. But okay, there's a band who is playing stuff from Transylvania. And if I didn't listen to the singing, and the style of singing was rather different, but if I just listened to what was being played by this fiddle band, it sounded exactly like Legényes and some of the same exact tunes, which I guess is not surprising.
Not surprising at all, of course. I mean,
well, no, I mean, you know, when your dad brought groups from Transylvania, Saschavas, I'm thinking of specifically, mm-hmm. I told them, look, I know you guys play for, you know, Hungarians, Roma, Sas, of which there are a lot of Sas in Cleveland and have been. In fact, I think that's how we ended up with so many Romanians and also Transylvanian Hungarians here, was because they came first, because there was the kind of German connection, and Romanian. And I said, listen, I want you to play everything from your repertoire. Mm-hmm. And again, we also had this idea that village musicians are just kind of walking down the dusty road with their fiddle and all of that. But these guys, they take it seriously, and they're also kind of trying to make a living at it. Yeah. At least in some areas, they are and were. So of course, you're going to learn the stuff from each group, and if it happens to have a lot of overlap, well, so it is.
Yeah. Walt, I know you've lived, and I'm going to change a little direction here. Yeah. I know you've lived most of your life in Cleveland, but there was a time when you were relocated for work to New Brunswick, New Jersey, and what was the Hungarian scene like there? I think that was late '80s, and what was your few years in the New Brunswick, New Jersey, and New York metropolitan area like musically?
That was very interesting. Well, the first thing I have to tell you, I relocated to New Brunswick to work for Union Carbide Corporation once I was done with grad school, and I had no idea of the Hungarian connection. Mm-hmm. But I remember seeing the statue of Cardinal Mindszenty in front of St. Ladislas, I guess there. Yep. Pointing, and he seemed to be saying, "Go to the Csárdas restaurant," which I did. And there were Hungarian shops and butcher shops and all this sort of stuff. When I was involved with that culturally, I did not get a chance when I was in New Brunswick, and which I'm sad about. I didn't get a chance to really connect with the Hungarian community as much as I would have liked to. Mm-hmm. I did, for a while, I did get to know some of the musicians, though, because I lived outside of New Brunswick for a time in Franklin Park, and there was a wonderful place called the Franklin Park Inn, mm-hmm. Which I could walk to and stumble back from, where there was, they would have a gypsy band playing different ones, typically down from New York, every Sunday night. And then if you hung around, which I did, if you hung around in the bar, which was this, I don't know if you were ever there.
No.
You might have been too young. Yeah. But what happened is that after about 11 o'clock, I mean, the band would end maybe 9:30 or 10, but after about 11 o'clock, musicians who had been playing in Philadelphia and New York, playing weddings or who knows what they were doing, started filtering in. And, I met a number of them, including the late Paul Zitai, who was a wonderful fiddler, and very interestingly, he had actually written out some of his music.
Yes, very well, exactly, yep.
Which he, I recognized his name because I guess I had got some, there was, and again, the late David Skews, who was a really wonderful violinist and had an interest in music from all over the world, particularly Eastern Europe, and learned to speak Hungarian, married a Hungarian, did all those sorts of things. But he gave me some of the Paul Zitai notes, and for me, that was, a revelation. Yeah. Particularly getting to understand the chord structure. And I'll tell you a little later, I'll tell you the advantage that gave me. Mm-hmm. But, I did hear that. And then I would, of course, go to the occasional thing up in New Jersey, connected with things that your parents were putting on. Certainly I went to Hungarian House in New York City. I was very heavily involved with various sorts of South Slavic music, and beginning to get involved with Romanian music too, through connections there. There were a lot of musicians and very welcoming people in New York in the mid-'80s. I sort of immediately fell into playing a lot of the stuff that was familiar to me. I had a Tamburica orchestra together with Bernadette Lukatic, actually, who was the daughter of the president of the Croatian Fraternal Union. She was living in New York, and would go down and play in Philadelphia often, and also back to Steelton, Pennsylvania, which was, I guess, about maybe 2.5, 3 hours drive from New York.
Yeah.
But it was the nearest place that felt like the Midwest.
Yes.
Yeah. And, I also met George Kaba, who was a Romanian-American violinist who played with a Tumberidze orchestra, but he, also had a whole repertoire of Romanian stuff from Banat that he taught me. Mm-hmm. On accordion, which is what I was playing with him, at the time it seemed a little bit boring because the only function of the accordion was to work like a bracha.
Right.
That was it. But I learned that that's what you do, and stylistically that's it. Mm-hmm. And so it was great in that way. And I did hear, I certainly heard some really wonderful gypsy musicians. I didn't get much of a chance to play Hungarian music, in part because of some of the purest feelings on some of the musicians who were playing for Tanchaz at the time. And I'm not talking about you. I'm talking about the people who were sort of part of the Tanchaz bands that were connected with folk dancers. That, oh no, one wouldn't ever have accordion in Transylvanian music. We could ask Shoma about that.
Yeah.
might disabuse you of that notion, but that certainly was the fashion and the style then. So that was it, and I will say, really, being in New Brunswick, it made me feel a lot more like being at home.
Yeah. Well, Vincent is still there, and he's probably pointing at like the Taco Bell now down the street. But
oh no.
Well, yeah. But and Paul Zita is an interesting connection. Of course, he was the guy who played at the Plaza Hotel during the luncheons. Him and a pianist, they would play a duo. He played there for years.
Yeah.
And you mentioned the advantage that Paul Zita's notes that you got through David Skewes. And by the way, I've seen those notes too, and still have copies probably. What advantage did they give you later on?
Well, the advantage they gave me was this. I came back to Cleveland at the end of 1988. Shortly after that, I met Stephen Greenman, the violinist.
Yep.
And he knew people who were in my college fraternity, and they said, "Oh, you need to meet Walt Mahovlich. You guys are interested in a lot of the same music together." And it turned out he was really interested in. He had listened to people like Magyar Jr, who I still think was the best gypsy primash of the 20th century. Mm-hmm. That's all there was to it, in my humble, not so humble opinion.
Yeah.
But we bonded over that, and we played through some stuff, and I dug out those notes, and I learned to play Joestit Kivanok and with the right chords. That was the key thing, because Zitai knew the harmonization, and he wrote out the key things, which I then learned. So when we were starting Harmonia, we didn't even have a name at that point, but I was in a Xerox place making musical copies, and this sweet old woman walks up to me, not too far from my house. Sweet old woman walks up to me and says, "Oh, music." I said, "Yeah." "What kind music?" "Folk music." "Oh, my husband, he play very good folk music." Mm. Well, this was Öcsi, who was the wife of Joe Varga, who was from Nagyvarad, and had actually been, he was Roma, he's a gypsy, and he was highly trained. He played with the symphony orchestra in Nagyvarad, and also knew all the other repertoire, just about everything.
He's a bass player, yeah?
He was our first bass player.
Yeah.
And he was a wonderful, wonderful bass player.
Yeah.
And so what happened, and I remember, I think the first thing I played with him was Jó estét kívánok, which gajo players now will start on the tonic. Let's say you're playing it in the key of D, which you wouldn't necessarily do unless you were singing, but that's a good key for singing it.
Yeah.
It doesn't start on a D chord.
Yes. Starts on the G. Yeah.
That's the whole thing, and it's got these other movements.
Yeah.
These other movements of chords, which to somebody who comes from a background of a music where harmony is functional harmony, and it doesn't have all these implied bass lines and stuff like that, you wouldn't guess at that. But anyhow, I knew that, and he said, "Oh," he says to me, "You're playing the gypsy chords."
Nice.
And he said, well, so then he immediately had respect for us and realized even if we didn't know all that much, we were teachable and that we could learn. And so Joe, taught me just so much about Hungarian music, so much about chord structure. I mean, he is in large part responsible for the existence of Harmonia as it is now. His life was not the happiest. He left because the situation for Hungarians, even if there were gypsies, was certainly pretty lousy in the 70s. And he was sort of pressured out, and he left. And he didn't even take his bass with him because he figured, well, I'm going to America. It's going to be a wonderful place. Everything's paved with gold. He could never afford to get a symphony quality bass or how to or learn quite how to get classical jobs and stuff like that.
Right.
But at least he and his spirit and the stuff that he taught us lives on in that way. And because of that, he also introduced me to John Markovich, who's also from Oradea, which is to say Nagyvarad.
Yeah.
Who is a guitarist who knows an awful lot about harmony. I mean, and who also taught me some of this stuff. So that through this connection with Zitai, it kind of kick-started what we were doing and enabled us to at least be taught.
That's a very fortunate turn, and then I wonder if you would have started the Jó estét kívánok in the chord of D rather than G. What he would have reacted about, when maybe rolled his eyes and thank you for your time and went away. I mean, it's nice to have a good start like that, fortuitous for sure.
Right, absolutely,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think maybe he would have done that.
Yeah.
Because he was not somebody who suffered fools gladly.
Yes.
Did you ever meet him?
No. I might have, Walt. I don't think so. Where did he move to California or something?
No. That is Mezde Elemer,
Okay.
who also was very helpful to us, the tuba player.
Right.
But no, Joe. Because Joe never went on the road with us. He unfortunately, for the last 17 years of his life, he was on dialysis, which was remarkable that he lasted that long on it. He didn't go on the road with us ever. And he was pretty irascible. I remember we were in a photo shoot one time, and because his English was really minimal. I'm so sorry I didn't get a chance to really learn any Hungarian while he was alive, because I would have loved to do that. I mean, I'm studying it. It's daunting, but I'm getting somewhere.
Okay.
Though I don't want to do it over the radio.
Yeah, don't be careful.
But, I remember I was in a photo shoot at one point when I said to Sylvia, the Keresztesi Sylvia, gosh, I just wish I could understand what Joe was saying. And she said, no, you don't. At one point, you probably know our old violinist, a wonderful Croatian-American musician, uh, uh,
Marco Dreher, yeah.
And he says something to Marco in Hungarian, and I asked him, what was that? And he said to him, your mother didn't spank you enough. and Marco replied, well, my mother never spanked me. So there you are. But gosh, I'm so happy I got a chance to meet him and to have that, just a tiny fraction of that musical knowledge passed on. And, he was one of those musicians. And again, he honestly, he really did not like the still called Tanchaz stuff. Because he would say, oh, this is low village music. I mean, he could play it, but he thought it was low class.
Yeah. No, well, it's because it was simple musically, maybe not challenging in his mind to him,
Yeah, I believe you me, it's very challenging to me.
Yeah.
It, it requires an awful lot of understanding and work to play it correctly. But again, it just had a different association with him than it would for me, or certainly for you.
Yeah.
He was also sensitive about wearing a hat on stage. He didn't want to do that because that was a symbol that was a symbol of being a villager, basically. And
right.
He was, high class city musician in his outlook.
Yeah. Well, Harmonia. So that's kind of the foundation of Harmonia, and Harmonia Band has gone through different musicians over the years, obviously, which as will happen, and the band's over 20 years old. It's a ragtag bunch of people from Eastern Europe and the Carpathian Basin in terms of nationalities. You obviously there's you're the foundational support of it, but you have Ukrainians and the Slovaks, and Steve is the Jewish klezmer type of background. What's it like to bring together those different types of personalities and different types of experiences in life as the leader of that type of band?
Well, I'll tell you what. Well, it certainly does require diplomacy, I will tell you that. Because actually, Harmonia, it's coming up on 30 years, because we really started in 91. Mm-hmm. And since 97, with the addition of Alex Fedoriuk, our Ukrainian cymbal player, it's actually, we've had a pretty stable core, I would say. Because, right now, there is some fluidity in our bassist, because our kind of number one call bassist lives in Yonkers, and that's complicated.
Yeah, that's Branyo Brinarski, who also plays in Eletfa, so he's a Tanchaz musician as well. Yep. Wonderful
player, phenomenal singer, multi-instrumentalist. I don't know if you've ever heard him play and sing with the Slovak Fujara. That's the 8-foot-tall flute.
Yeah.
Overtone flute. That's really, truly wonderful. Amazing player of many kinds of stuff. Mainstay of the Tanchaz scene. We recently started playing with kind of full-time in Cleveland with Cătălin Petrescu, who's from Transylvania. I've known him since he came to this country in 90. He came just before Ceausescu fell. Mm-hmm. So what was that, 91?
Yeah, I think 90, 80, Christmas 89, 90, yeah.
He came right then and stayed, and, had played. I've known him ever since then and stayed with, he'd been playing a lot of Romanian stuff all over the country. Wonderful player of Romanian, all different layers of that. But he went to conservatory, and he's got a great repertoire of Hungarian operettas. It turns out, knows how all of them go. He knows them better than me. I'll certainly say that, because he used to play for Hungarians all the time when he was back back in the old country.
What instrument does he play, Walt?
He plays bass.
Okay, he's a bassist. Great.
His first instrument was cello, which he still plays. We're hoping to work some things with cello. Of course, Beata Beganyova, who is a wonderful musician. She actually plays accordion just beautifully, but since she's such a remarkable singer, she's of Carpatho-Russian descent, or what Hungarians typically call Ruthenian or Rusin. And she's a wonderful singer. She has great, in addition to folk music, which she knows quite well, she has a great interest in popular music of various sorts. I'm blessed with having two really wonderful violinists who've been with me for a very long time. Stephen from the beginning, and then, of course, Joseph, who is from Puchov, Slovakia, and he trained with gypsy musicians, Hungarian gypsy musicians, and loves, Hungarian music.
Yeah.
From the time that he started playing violin, which interestingly was when he was 16. So, he came here and managed to get into the Tammys, spent a year with that. In principle, Andrei Pitkivka, a multi-instrumentalist, player of various folk flutes, does play with us in concerts. He's in Washington, so we don't play as regularly with him as we used to in concert, but we do when we can afford to do it. Yeah. And myself on accordion, we occasionally have slightly different formations. I would say if we're playing a ball, then we always add a guitarist so that we can kind of play the ball music. We have a version of our band that is aimed at playing the equivalent of ball music, but for Ukrainians, and so we've got a trumpet player that we add, and another drummer, and Alex switches over to keyboard. And I spend most of my time playing sax in that. It's been a bit more stable. It's been remarkably stable compared to other bands.
Yeah. Yeah. No. It really has.
And when we, if we do either a Slavic festival or a Romanian festival, we oftentimes call on a friend. Typically it'll be Justin Greenwald, who's a phenomenal accordionist, which frees me up to play wind instruments.
Right. Watching a Harmonia concert, I think the audience and I've been struck at the flow of the show, and it's unique. You'll finish a number and then all of a sudden it'll be like the timbalom or maybe even you on accordion will just kind of start playing in the background, and then you with your your soothing tenor voice will start talking about the next number or something about history or some anecdote about the band. It's a very, very well thought out set list. That's my impression. What goes into that, and in terms of everyone seems to know what's next and what's going on in the show, and I don't know if that's just playing together, let's say, with Alex for more than 20 years, or is that something that you guys actually practice and work on, the flow?
It's something that we're very conscious of. When we decided to kind of take the show on the road, which was about 78, or not 78, sorry, maybe around 98, some of the advice that I got from people who were playing in other bands. I've got friends who play with the Klezmatics, for example, which is, a klezmer band that's been around actually longer than Harmonia, interestingly, and has done very well. But, they said, you always need to have in mind, what's coming next. And I also got some advice for people who were talking about, frankly, about marketing that helped me. And again, because we, the way that I do things, if I'm playing a concert for, let's say, Hungarians or Slovaks or Romanians, I don't really do that. Things do flow because we figured out what we're going to play. But I don't feel the necessity of really telling a story. But if I'm playing for a multi-ethnic or quote-unquote American group, it's really necessary, I think, to put the music in context.
Yeah.
And to make the show be all of a piece, for one thing to flow into the other, and also to give some cultural understanding of what's going on. I mean, we might do, say, a set of wedding songs from Eastern Slovakia where Beata grew up, and she can, both she and I can talk about that, about that experience. Because otherwise, just playing the tune, they're beautiful, but if you don't have an idea of what it's about, emotionally, it's going to be harder to connect with it.
Right.
And one of the things that I spend a lot of time talking about is what the experience of this music was for people like my grandparents and parents and me, who are here in the United States. Because, I did not learn to play this music in Budapest, growing up in Budapest, or for that matter, growing up in a village in Transylvania, or heck, in Zsumberak in Croatia, where my dad's family is from. But I feel that experience is very valid and important, and also, it's popular as well. And I had somebody make a comment to me once, which was something that I really thought about. We went to see the really wonderful group Taraf de Haiduks from Clujani in Romania.
Yeah.
And who are wonderful musicians. And they're kind of a floating group. They're sort of all related through family connections, and you're not quite sure whoever's going to show up, but they'll all be very good. But the comment I got was, we love seeing Harmonia actually more than these guys because they're hills and valleys in your music. You guys don't just decide everything's got to be really fast.
Mm-hmm.
Because, you've heard that the audiences like fast music. And I try to make sure that there's a certain amount of flow and drama, and it's stuff that I kind of obsess over.
Right.
And also we are at the stage where if we need to make a change on the fly, and because people do pay attention, we can change the program while we're up there. And, they're kind of the signals that I'm able to give to the other guys, which generally they catch.
Right, generally.
Generally,
yeah.
and we're pretty good about that in that way.
Walt, that's very, very good advice, even for somewhat of a seasoned veteran like myself, to really focus on the emotional connection to the music, because we have that. When we hear a song, we'll think of Buckeye Road, or we'll think of that year in away from college, or we'll think about grandma, but not everybody has that. So, was that the advice you received from your marketing expert? Was that, I mentioned? I noted down that someone in marketing gave you some advice.
Right. He was an agent actually, and he said you need to tell a story.
Yeah.
You need to tell a story with your music. And he said, you guys are all fabulous musicians, but you really need to tell a story to be able to audiences effectively. And I think he's right. And, again, it's a different, it's a different thing. If I go to a Hungarian event or I go to a Croatian event, just hearing a song is going to be evocative. It might cause me to choke up. Well, and talking about choking up, there we are. I won't butcher the Hungarian phrase, but there's the phrase that you could roughly translate as the the Hungarian is happy when he's crying.
Yes.
Vidam a Magyar sír.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. And that's a kind of feeling that I have that feeling, and it's not only the Hungarians who have that feeling. There are other people in Eastern and Central Europe who have that, but that's very foreign to people in the United States.
Yes.
And so one of the things that I do, I mean, when we end up playing a suite of, the typical the Hungarian sort of restaurant-style suite where you have, start off with a hallgato and stuff like that, I have to explain, what the emotional feeling of it is. I often tell the story that one of my students said to me, hearing some music I was listening to, "Mr. Mahovlich, do you play that stuff when you're happy?" And I said, "No, we play that to get happy." And that's the difference,
Yeah.
That's the difference. I mean, it gets you there. It gets you to that place.
Yeah. Walt, that's fantastic advice, I think, for all performers of anything, and also for audiences. And establishing that evocative, emotional connection, one way or the other, and also playing to the specific audience that you need to play to. Let me shift a little and let's talk about your experience. Now you're studying what is termed as ethnography, which I want you to talk about. But you spent a couple of months at the University of Sarajevo, and I would say in former Yugoslavia in the 1970s, things were still together then in terms of that country. You're not an ethnomusicologist by formal training. You certainly have the experience and deep knowledge of one, but what is ethnography? What kind of things did you study there? And tell me about your travels and your experiences in former Yugoslavia around that time.
Okay. Well, first off, the term actually isn't ethnography, because ethnography is the recording of traditional customs and things like that, sort of like photography, but in this case, recording the, writing about and preserving. Ethnology.
Ethnology. Okay.
Yeah, ethnologia.
Right.
It's a term that we don't really use in the West so much. It's sort of like cultural anthropology without the sort of physical anthropology part. It's something that's sort of the closest thing here might be the study of folklore. Okay, but it's a little different than that. But it was a fascinating experience. It was the second time that I was in former Yugoslavia, because the first time I was there was to go and perform at Smotra in 1974. And then I wanted to go back. I knew that there was a Serbian guy who was a professor of mine, back when I started college in Michigan, that was leading, continued to lead groups of students to the University of Sarajevo. And, here it was. It turns out that the people I had lectures from, and I mentioned Dunja Richtman, they were just, world famous, absolutely world famous, and deservedly so in terms of their understanding of kind of the folk process. So that was great. That gave me, another way of looking at things, and sort of looking realistically at the development of folk customs and the way things spread. Also, that same year, I got a chance to spend a little bit of time in Zagreb at and met some people from the University of Zagreb, from the Center for Folk Arts, it would be sort of like folk science, you might say. But it's a study of folk arts. That we're talking about to me about things like cultural diffusion and the way that ideas can spread. We have this idea that before the modern age, people lived in isolated ways. But actually, there's some truth to that. But the big thing is that ideas, cultural ideas, spread. It just took a little longer. You can see it in the way that there's the spread of musical ideas, the spread of ideas about dress, about cooking, all of that sort of stuff. And that opened my eyes to a lot of things. My experience in Sarajevo, specifically, because most people know Sarajevo because of two horrible incidents. One was the assassination in 1914 of Archduke Franz Ferdinand,
yeah.
and then the horrible siege that lasted for 3 years in the early 1990s.
Yeah.
But when I was there, it was an amazingly vibrant place. It was multi-ethnic. You had Serbs, Croats, Bosnian Muslims, and a sprinkling of others as well. And you had this really interesting mix of things going on. You had traditional kind of Ottoman-style city culture, little shops and things like that had been there, rations on cobblestone streets, and it even looks like things that you wouldn't see in Turkey now. And you also, had contact with people who lived in surrounding villages. I had a good friend that I had actually met at the Smithsonian the year before that I went to visit, a phenomenal singer, Chamil Mehtiljevic, who was living in a village, not that far from the city, but, it was really village life. Really village life. And, he was a really traditional musician and actually is still singing, which I'm glad to find out because I lost track of him for a long time. But at the same time that you had this sort of stuff going on, this was a very vibrant, tapped into the rest of the world city. You had experimental theater stuff going on, which I had never seen in the United States. The idea of combining sort of life-size puppets with live actors, which was cutting edge at the time. Filmmaking and rock music and fashion, all of that. It was just amazing to see both of those things happening at the same time, and people who sometimes operate in multiple worlds in that way.
Right.
Somebody might be a fashion designer but loves to sing, Bosnian songs, let's say. That was a great and wonderful and eye-opening picture. To me, it was a little bit summed up because you could go to a cafe and order on the same plate baklava and doboshtorta. So, it's this place where kind of Central Europe and the Middle East met.
Beautiful.
For better or for worse. There was a lot that was good about that too,
Yeah.
And
yeah. No, it sounds like.
So it was really quite amazing, and my experiences throughout former Yugoslavia in '77 were uniformly warm and welcoming. I had friends all over the country. Of course, my relatives in Croatia, new friends that I made in Zagreb, and then traveled to visit Serbian friends right in Šumadija, in the middle of the country, who were living these interesting traditional lives, but with some intersections with modernity, who were extraordinarily hospitable and sang these wonderful, very traditional a cappella songs, even while I was there in August, and they were harvesting things.
Mm-hmm.
And there you are. And then I was down in Macedonia as well. That had a lot of influence on me. it helped imbue me with a love of those cultures. I mean, which I already had, but now it was not just kind of a half-remembered fantasy for my grandparents, but seeing it right up in there. So that was great. Certainly, yeah. I mean, that had a lot of influence on me when I came back, and it's actually after I came back from there that I landed a job working for the Greater Cleveland Ethnographic Museum, which existed for a couple of years, which enabled me to do, field work, collecting oral histories from the Great Wave of Immigration, and also to do the ethnomusicological stuff I did in terms of documentation of Easter customs and, looking at Balkan Slavic music, which was, the title was a big mouthful, but it's partially because we wanted to avoid the word Yugoslav, and also because if you just said South Slavic, it would include the Slovenians, who are certainly fine people and ethnically related, but on the other hand, they were part of a whole different musical world that really was not tied in with the rest of it.
And that's where that your work was encapsulated in that Nova Domovina, the UN, which UN award, the UNESCO award for musicology.
Yeah, and of course, Nova Domovina means a new homeland.
Mm-hmm. Right, which it certainly became. Walt, I think we're gonna probably some future episode we might devote to talking about the breakup of Yugoslavia. Of course, Hungarians are involved in that as well because of the Hungarian minority there and the neighbor in Yugoslavia minority population, but also, of course, being the neighbor, and then how that impacted and affected what we the communities here, which we're getting along. At least musically speaking, and then things started to change, and I'll never forget in 93 or 94 with the Tamburitsins, we had our first show cancellation because someone had called in a bomb threat before one of our shows. It's like, like things have started kind of going downhill, and I'm sure that impacted, of course, the church basement communities all over the place here.
Good God, yes it did.
yeah, so that's a whole different topic, but I want to close on a question that might be answerable, or you might know an answer to, or you might want to consider. But when you're around 40 years old, you decided to start relying on music as your primary form of living, right? And how did your relationship with music change when you began relying on it for your income primarily?
Well, it did change. For one thing, I found it necessary to do things musically that were not necessarily just fun.
Mm-hmm.
I did put, basically what happened is I was caught in a layoff. I had reasons, particularly because of an aging parent, that I needed to stay in Cleveland, and I felt burnt out. I mean, I didn't really like, the only thing, I liked doing science. I liked being creative in that way. I certainly liked the income, I'll be honest. But on the other hand, it was preventing me from doing the artistic stuff I wanted to do. And there were a lot of, examples of that. I mean, one thing I regret is that because I was worried that a round of layoffs was coming, I was asked to go on a tour of Yugoslavia with the Tomov Ensemble, which it turns out was the last possible time to do it. And I just had to say, no, I can't ask for any time off to do that. But in terms of the relationship with music, well, the first thing that happened was that I put out the word to all of my friends, look, if you got a gig, wherever it is in the country, call me, I'll go and play. So I was driving to, Vermont to play with Alicia Spiegels, who you might know.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, a wonderful violinist.
Mm-hmm.
doing things frequently in New York, though I was living here, and I remember one of my friends from New York said, "Well, why don't you just move back?" And I said, "Well, for what it cost me to live in Cleveland in a house, I compared to what it costs to live there, I could buy a pack of airline tickets and go back and forth every weekend."
Right.
And I was traveling very frequently there in the early and mid '90s. What it did do, though, is that it gave me opportunities to do things and have experiences that I otherwise wouldn't have. So, for example, I ended up playing with this band that Basin was in, Budovitz, which was based in Graz. I had a part-time teaching gig. It wasn't that hard for me to get time off. At that time, there were still people, the people who hired me were still there, and they realized what a bargain they were getting. I was teaching English as a second language on kind of a part-time basis with the school system and preparing the new immigrant kids for science and math and stuff like that. But, it meant I could travel to Austria. I could tour in Hungary and Italy and the Netherlands and places like that, and Germany. Actually, I didn't really tour Hungary. We did stuff in Budapest, but I was touring in Germany and Switzerland, Italy, and that's an experience I could never have had if I had just remained, tied to a job that gives you 2 weeks off and that's it.
Yeah.
And I kind of came to the conclusion that if maybe about 30% of what I play on a gig is stuff that makes me happy to play, that's okay. The other thing that changed was that there was an awful lot of sort of logistical stuff that really became important. It wasn't, just show up and play a gig, because, suddenly I was really a band leader. And, putting things together for a ball, making sure you're playing the right stuff, and convincing the other musicians that, yes, this is really what they want to hear, and let's rehearse it, please. Becomes something different. I mean, it's different than just doing a band that does, either occasional ethnic gigs or the occasional concert, and you're just playing the stuff that you want to play. But there's also, for me, there's a real joy in getting a deep understanding of what people see as their own, and what people, see as what you need to play for them. And I had already known that for Croatians and certainly Macedonians, and, knew some of that for Hungarians. I mean, for, third generation American Hungarians. Having been around that, but, learning how to play fancy balls, because my folks were not the people, who put on ball gowns and went to
Right.
black tie events.
Right.
I knew about the night in Budapest, which was a big deal in Cleveland, but it's a bit too rich for our blood. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. But it's been fascinating, and it ends up being a full-time job. I mean, of course, during the pandemic, no, but it ends up being a full-time job because to do this right, there's a lot of preparation that goes into it, and I'm not just talking about practice. I mean, to me, the ability to play your instrument well is only part of it. It's not only how you play, but knowing what to play and when. And that takes a lot. I mean, particularly when what you're trying to do is play for many different ethnic groups. And, one of the things I say when we talk about our wedding band version of Harmonia is mixed weddings a specialty. Because we can do it. I mean, I'll tell you, the strangest one I ever came up with was some Macedonian Americans asked me, they said, "Oh, can you play for our son's wedding?" I said, "Certainly." And I said, "Well, what nationality is the bride?" "She's Finnish." "Can you play any Finnish music?" And I said, "Sure."
Yeah, that's our specialty.
Well, I didn't think that's our specialty, but I said sure, and I prepared, and did it, and we did it. We certainly didn't play it as well as the other stuff, but we played enough to make people happy.
Right.
So
that's funny.
And the other thing I would say, and I really learned this then, because except for a couple of gigs in New York, I was not playing in restaurants. Typically it was dances, picnics, things like that. But part of setting out to make your living from music, one of the things you needed to do was play in restaurants and do strolling music, and the importance of figuring out what people are want to hear. And I was always playing in ethnic places, and one of my mottos was, you should certainly learn the most popular piece for every nationality you're likely to encounter, but you can't learn just that. You need to know 2 or 3 so you've got some depth.
Yeah.
And it worked fine. It's something that I probably physically couldn't do it anymore. But my friend Sasho, who's a wonderful accordionist who his parents sent him back to Macedonia to study in Bitola, and he said, the restaurant is the school for musicians. And he is on many levels right. First off, you get a chance to play things over and over and over, and the way you think about things when you are playing it, as opposed to rehearsing it, is different. Different ideas come to you. Mm-hmm. And you also get to know what your audiences are like.
Well, absolutely. Walt, you're like I like to say when I think of you, you're the thinking man's musician, and you have a lot of different audiences that you play for, not just nationalities, but instrumentation and the way you lay out the program. And like I say, I think people who attend a Harmonia concert, for instance, really get to see that. And I think this is probably a good place to stop. Like I say to all of my guests, we can go for days and weeks talking, and we do and we have. But I'd like to have you back on in several months from now to continue our discussion. And I really appreciate your time and your energy and everything that you're doing for not just Hungarian music, but all ethnic music. And I wish you the best of work in the decades to come still.
Well, thank you very much, Öcsi, and I hope that in the not-too-distant future we'll be able to see each other and play together again.
That would be great. That sounds like a plan. Well, thank you once again for being on. And on behalf of myself, Kalman Magyar, Öcsi, and Walt Mahovlich, and the Tanchaz Talk program, thank you for tuning in. And make sure you let a friend know about the show, or 2 or 3 friends about the show, and keep spreading the word. Until next time, have a wonderful day, and chat with you soon.